Hi, Gary Chillingworth here for Airgun World Magazine, Shooting Country TV. Welcome to Back to Basics with Daystate. Today's video is all about getting triggered, or more importantly, trigger control. Now, what we're not going to do today is show you how to adjust the trigger on this awesome Black Wolf, because there's no point in spending 15 minutes telling you how to adjust the trigger on this one gun, because all triggers are different. Yes, a lot of manufacturers use the same trigger setup in all of their guns, but if I show you how to adjust this, then if you shoot a BSA, an air arms, an Anschuts, it won't apply to you. So it's a bit of a waste of time. Also, Daystate have created a really brilliant video on how to adjust the trigger on this rifle, and I will put that in a link in the description below. So if you want to know how to adjust this amazing trigger, just go and watch that video, because it's better than anything I can do. But what we are going to do is we're going to look at trigger control and how it can affect your accuracy. Now, today is a bit of a strange day. It's the one day we've had in 2026 so far where it's not been tipping it down with rain, but it is actually quite windy. So I don't know what kind of groups we're going to get, or even if we're going to attempt groups. But what we are going to do is we're going to go through the basics of trigger control, how to get the best out of it. We'll talk a bit about breathing as well and how to match up the two. And hopefully we're going to improve your accuracy. Welcome to Back to Basics with Daystate. Okay, so let's talk about terminology of triggers, stuff that we're going to be talking about. So first of all, we're going to break down what the different bits are. I'll put a box up so you can see me doing the bits to help explain it, because sometimes brainy, not telly-mouthy what to do properly, but pictures are better. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Right, so first thing is first stage, and that is where you place your finger on the trigger and you pull it back until you feel that stop, that first stop. That first stop is any further back and the gun will fire. Pulling it beyond that first stage into the second stage and making the gun fire, that is your second stage. So first stage up to the break, and then second stage is when you pull it back and it goes bang. The break is when you pull the trigger back, you hold it on that point, and then you pull it that little bit more, and then you get that snap, and that's when the gun fires. That is what is known as the trigger break. And when somebody talks about the weight of the trigger, they're talking about the weight of that break. If you pull it back and you hold it on that first stage and your trigger's only a few ounces, just the slightest pressure and the rifle will fire. If you've got your trigger set to 2 or 3 pounds and you've really got to yank the trigger back as hard as you can, that's a heavy break. Now, in HFT, you want a trigger as light as you can get it where it's safe. And this is something that's really important. Predominantly more for spring guns than PCPs. If you set your rifle too light and you give it a bang and it's cocked, the gun can go off. I have had this happen to myself when I've set my gun too light. So when you are setting up a trigger and you are specifically setting the weight of that break, you need to make sure that that gun will not go off when you give it a tap or something like that. Now, obviously, with a spring gun, you've always got to make sure there's a pellet in the breech. With this rifle, it's got a super light trigger, virtually nothing. If I cock it here and I hit it further back, it won't go off. So, set the break as light as you can where it is still safe for what you need to do. Okay, so we're in competition and we've got our rifle and we've got a nice light trigger. So we're on our target, and I'll put a little box around the end of the muzzle brake. Obviously, we've fired this rifle off just to show. There you go. We're on a single shot tray, so we don't have a magazine. Now you can see the lines, and I'm just taking up my first stage, and then there's a slight squeeze, and we fire. And you notice that the barrel did not move at all as I was pulling the trigger. Now, it's a bit difficult to explain because the trigger on this is so good. But if you had a heavier trigger and you're having to put a couple of pounds of weight on it, and you get even a fraction of a movement by trying to pull, and obviously now we are, you know, we're pretending. Just going to fire that off. If you have a millimetre of movement here at the peg, when you get to 40 yards, that's going to be 20-30 millimetres off centre, and you're going to miss your target and you're going to have a huge problem. So you need to be able to get to a point where you can pull that trigger and it not affect the end of the barrel. That is one of the most important things you can do in shooting. Okay, so the next part that we want to speak about is when do you take your finger off the trigger? And I know this sounds really silly, but the legend that is Mr. Terry of Doe, he told me many years ago, and it's actually something that is very, very important, that when you shoot, you cock your rifle, again unloaded, you take up your shot, your aim, place your finger on the trigger, fire, and only when you have released your finger do you remove your head from the comb and look up. What you see a lot of times is people go on the target, pull and go like that, and they're already moving while their finger is still on the trigger. And again, that can affect accuracy. You end up with a bit of a flinch because you want to look up and see what's happened. Finger on the trigger, pull the trigger, wait, release the trigger, and then only start moving. Until that pellet has hit that target, keep your eye behind the scope and get your finger off that trigger and into a position of safety. And that's another thing we really should have covered right at the start. You will see a lot of shooters and they will keep their finger there. If you watch any kind of TV program with SWAT or military, they all keep their finger up there. That's when they're on the gun, and only when they're ready to put their finger on the trigger do they move down, take up their first stage and fire. Now, there are many times that I have seen people, and this is predominantly with standards, but I've also seen it prone, where someone often comes up above and then they drop down onto the target. So they keep their finger on the trigger, and then they drop down, and if you notice the rifle is pivoting, and as it pivots down, they pull the trigger, or they get an involuntary muscle spasm. It happens. I've had it where I've been on the peg, I've gone like that, I've gone to put my finger on the trigger, and I've just pulled through the trigger. But because my finger stays in this position until my crosshairs are in the kill zone and I know where I want to be. Once it's in the kill zone, I then pull my finger down, put it on the trigger, so that way if I accidentally pull through, my crosshairs are pointing at the kill zone of the target or the quarry, and there's still a chance that you'll at least score 1 point, but on more than one occasion, I've scored 2. Now that's not a negligent discharge, because I've got the rifle under control, I'm pointing it at the target, I'm moving down onto the trigger, and yes, I've pulled the trigger early, but the rifle was on target, so it was safe. Do not put your finger on the trigger until you know where that pellet is heading for. Now, a lot of people will say it's really important to squeeze the trigger, not pull the trigger. Yes, you know, to a certain degree, when we cock the rifle, what we want to do is we want to use the soft pad at the end of our finger, place it on the trigger, take up the first stage, take in a breath, hold it, and fire. What you don't want to be doing is using that hook bit in your finger where there isn't as much sensitivity. There aren't as many nerve endings in that bit there, because sometimes what you certainly don't want to do is be on target and just sort of not snatch the trigger, but sort of bounce the trigger with a quick jerky motion. I shot with someone who was a powder burner, shooting big caliber rifles, and they said to me once, you want to be surprised by the trigger, because that way you get a cleaner shot. And I've actually heard this more than once, and I can't think of anything worse. I want to know exactly when that gun is going to fire, and I want it to be my choice. And that is why having a really good trigger is very important. If you're going to adjust a trigger and you are going to move all the sears around, they all interact with each other. So if you move one, let's say you change the length of the first stage, that's great. Move it an eighth at a time, or eighth of a turn at a time, or a quarter of a turn maximum, and then check it. And only ever move in very, very small increments. Try not to move two things at once, because you will end up getting confused. Make a note of where everything is, write it down. So if you've moved your front sear 3/4 of a turn, write that down. I've moved it 3/4, so you know that you've moved it 3/4 of a turn anti-clockwise. So to put it back to where it was, 3/4 of a turn back. What Daystate have done, which is actually quite clever, and I hope a lot of the other manufacturers will follow suit, is that when you look at the trigger block, it's got 4 separate grub screws which adjust the trigger. They all start off completely flush along the trigger block. So no matter how much you screw up your trigger by trying to adjust it, putting it all back to that flat, level spot, the trigger will work, the gun will cock, and everything will be right with the world, and you can start again. So with the Black Wolf, if everything is flush, everything should work. And I think that's actually a really good idea. And our final thing for today is grip. Now, for some reason I've forgotten my glove. But this hand is incredibly important. When you're on target and your finger is on the trigger, if this hand slips, you're going to pull the trigger. So always make sure that you have a firm grip and you have the rifle under control before you put your finger anywhere near the trigger. These two hands must work in unison. This for grip, this for trigger. Don't use this hand, your trigger hand, to try and support the rifle. This really needs to be full floating. On this rifle, I've got the PRS butt pad and I've got the rifle supported at the back. So I'm gripping with the front, and this I can essentially come in and fire like that. I'm not using this hand to support the rifle. This hand just uses that finger to pull that trigger. That is today's Back to Basics with Daystate. We've had a quick look at trigger control, and I hope that I've given you a few basic tips on, well, basically how to improve, which will hopefully improve your accuracy. We could go in depth deeper, but to be honest with you, it's not that complicated. Set your trigger up right, set it up as light as you can so it's safe. Only put your finger on the trigger when you want to fire the rifle. Squeeze, don't pull, and control your breathing when you're doing so. If you do all of those things and then you experiment, and sometimes it's worth experimenting with bad trigger technique. Set out some paper at 25 yards and pull the trigger badly, jerk it, do whatever you want. see how it affects your groups. One thing though, if you're going to do that, once you've done some bad trigger technique, always finish off with some good trigger technique, because you don't want that to be the last thing that your brain remembers. I think that makes sense. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you on the range again very, very soon. Ta-da!